Hello, everybody. I can see that people are still dribbling in, but I once had a Marine as a boss. And one of the things I took from that experience was to start things on time and to run a magician trick. My name is Piper Campbell. I'm a recovering diplomat and an aspiring academic. I am chair of the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security. I am also, along with my esteemed friend and colleague, Ambassador Tony Wayne, who is the School of International Services diplomat in residence. We are the co-creators and co-coordinators of a speakers series here at the School of International Service, which is called Ambassadors Up Close. And the intent of the speakers series is really to both demystify the process of diplomacy and to help you to better understand just how hard and complicated it really is. So it's both demystifying and complexifying at the same time. A big part of the intent of the Ambassadors Up Close series, and it's right there in the name, is this idea of creating opportunities like this where people can both hear from speakers, but also have the opportunity to talk with those speakers, to really delve into some of their own thinking, some of the decision-making processes and policy processes of which they've been a part, and to understand things like career trajectories and how people get to positions, these senior positions, both in the US Department of State, but we also bring ambassadors and senior diplomats from other countries as well. It feels like it's an interesting time today to be having a conversation about diplomacy and about the future of diplomacy, diplomatic practice. So I suspect that will come up a little bit, both in the conversation, but also in the question and answer session today. But to say more approximately, the real topic of today's conversation is Nicholas Kralev's book, which I left at my seat. There is a diplomatic faux pas already. I was going to hold it up, but in order to hold it up, I need to have it.
Very happy to apply.
There we go. You can see it's tattered. I'm planning to use it in a class next semester, so I've been studying it. Nicholas Kralev's book, Diplomatic Tradecraft, to which some of our speakers, Ambassador Douglas Silliman and Ambassador Lisa Kubisky, contributed chapters and contributed their experiences. Nicholas was a journalist for the Washington Times who had I'm going to say pleasure, during that role, to travel with 3 different secretaries of state. And I cannot imagine 3 more different secretaries of state than Colin Powell, Susan Rice, and Hillary Clinton. Condi Rice, and Hillary Clinton. So as I think about Nicholas's experiences and his observations from the 3 of them, I think that there must be some wonderful facets to observing the 3 of them and trying to think about some similarities and differences across those 3 administrations, those 3 individuals. Little known fact, I joke with my students that I can bring Mongolia, where I was US ambassador, into any conversation. Well, I can do so here, because when Nicholas was writing America's Other Army, writing a book about the US Foreign Service, among the many places he visited and embassies he visited for that effort was the US Embassy in Ulaanbaatar. So it is nice to see him again. And a third interesting fact about Nicholas is that he is currently the director of the creator of the Washington International Diplomatic Academy, which has the idea of training diplomats, the idea that there are skills, that there is knowledge, that there are approaches to diplomacy, which are important aspects for diplomats to know. And so that work really has informed Nicholas's both his book, but other things that he's working on and that I suspect that he will talk with us about now. The way that this is going to work is Nicholas is going to come up and is going to explain a little bit more about the book, about this question of how to prepare diplomats. After that, Ambassador Tony Wayne is going to invite Nicholas and our two other contributors, Ambassador Silliman and Ambassador Kubisky, up to the stage, and Tony will moderate a bit of a conversation with them, and then we will open up to questions. So with that, let me please invite, and the QR code for ordering Nicholas's book is available on the screen. Nicholas, please. And Alice, I'm guessing that we should ask Nicholas also to use okay.
Okay, thank you. Beats shouting, so I prefer it. Okay, thank you very much for hosting this and to you for coming. Just sort of housekeeping first. So we only have a few copies of the book. If anyone wants a copy today, and of course, if you want to have it signed, you can use this QR code, and it'll take you to a link where you can purchase a copy and then keep your email receipt. Based on that, you will get your copy after we're done here talking. All right. Thanks again. I have been doing this for the last 4 weeks, nonstop in Europe. I just came back on Saturday. So now a domestic tour begins after the election. And I went from Bulgaria to Switzerland to Denmark to Germany to Britain to Ireland and somewhere, I'm sure I'm forgetting something. Okay. Several of the issues that I was going to bring up are already brought up, and I'm debating in my mind why I should start. But let me start from this idea about diplomacy as a skill set or a series of skills that in the past one could learn only on the job. I have interviewed for my books over 600 career Foreign Service officers over 2 decades. And every one of them told me that when they joined the Foreign Service, they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. Meaning that they didn't know what they will have to do on a daily basis, let alone how to do it. Which to me meant people came in without the skills to practice diplomacy. Now, I may be exaggerating just a little to make a point, but this happens essentially still to this day. And in my mind, if we are to make the case that the national interests of the United States, or any other country for that matter, are at stake in diplomacy, and if what diplomats do affects the lives of real people, as I call us, the ordinary people, right? Then it's just too important to leave to people figuring things out as they go. Now, today, for example, we have absolutely not even close to enough career diplomats around the world. India, with a population of 1.5 billion people, has 850 career diplomats. How does this make any sense? They made a big announcement last year. They were going to add 250 more. Imagine that. Brazil has 1,500 diplomats. How does any of this make sense? Now, the United States has by far the largest foreign service in the world. We have 13 members in total, and about 8,000 of them in the last decade or so have been what we call foreign service officers, right, or the diplomats. Here's some more intriguing numbers. Now, 8,000 may be a lot, but compared to what? So the US military, and I'm talking about only the active duty, not the reservists, the active duty members of the US military are 162 times more than the diplomats. Nobody's ever said they should be equal, but 162 times strikes me as a bit of an overkill. And then if we just take the numbers abroad, which is supposed to be the domain of diplomats, right? Just abroad, we have 6,800 career foreign service officers and 170,000 uniformed military members. I don't think politicians anywhere in the world really understand what diplomacy is about and what it can do for them, for these politicians, in terms of implementing their policies, right? And what to do and what it can do for statecraft, what we call statecraft. I'm using just these very few slides before the discussion just to make sure we're all here on the same page in terms of where diplomacy fits and what it means and all that. As you heard, I came to this as a journalist. Before the Washington Times, I was at the Financial Times. So Madeleine Albright was actually my first Secretary of State with whom I traveled. And you're absolutely right. The four of them, if you start with Albright and finish with Hillary Clinton, first of all, not one, look at them. I lucked out, right? All of them very impressive. Only one of them politician, one academic, actually two academics, and then one general. And when I was traveling with them, of course, I had to write these stories on policy that our editors, mine and those in other media organizations, the editors want you to write stories that can make the front page, which means you focus on policy, not on diplomacy, meaning you focus on the policy and the making of policy, not necessarily on how it's being carried out. And of course, that's what diplomats do for the most part, right? So for some reason, I took a very, very deep interest in that, in the implementation, in the practice of diplomacy. And it's been 20 years since I began my research. I visited about 80 embassies and consulates as I went around the world several times. And so I wanted just in the next couple of slides to give you an idea about how I've approached the profession of diplomacy in terms of the skills and the duties or the tradecraft that has become the foundation of the academy I founded 7 years ago and the book about which we are talking today. First of all, let's be very clear that diplomacy and foreign policy are not the same thing. I know you know it, but I want to emphasize it. Foreign policy has a toolbox, and in that toolbox, we have several tools. Historically, there have been three main ones: diplomacy, the use of force, or the military, and intelligence or spycraft. Today, we have things like investment and trade. We have foreign assistance and development. We have cultural diplomacy and all kinds of tools. But if we focus on these three, diplomacy, military, intelligence, this is how I think about where diplomacy fits in the national security system and in the bureaucracy. Because, like it or not, diplomacy is part of a huge bureaucracy. And unless you know the bureaucracy, know how to work it, you won't be able to succeed as a diplomat. And then in terms of what diplomats do, well, they do a lot of things, more things that I can probably mention in half an hour. So always at these talks, someone gets up at some point and says, well, you didn't mention so-and-so. Well, of course I didn't. I can't mention everything because there are literally dozens of things that happen in an embassy on a daily basis. But let's look at the big picture again. What diplomats do is what I call two parallel tracks. First, they manage relationships, whether bilateral or multilateral. And at the same time, they carry out their government's foreign policy, right? These are two different things, but they go in parallel. Yes, they also cross over, but ultimately managing a relationship and implementing a policy or a set of policies, I look at them as somewhat, again, not separate, but just in terms of defining it, let's call it separate. Okay, and when it comes to a definition, this is also, depending on where you look, you'll find different ways of describing diplomacy. I've looked at so many dictionaries, I don't even know how many are there by now, but pretty much all of the definitions I saw were different. Because again, diplomacy can be many things. And the activity of diplomacy includes many aspects. Now, politicians, I believe, look at diplomacy mostly as an activity, not a profession. So I really believe, based on my experience and having been to 107 countries in over more than 2 decades, I really think that 99% of politicians do not think that diplomacy is a real profession. They think that any intelligent, well-educated person from any walk of life can be parachuted in and do diplomacy. Because it's apparently logical enough and people can figure it out. But I do look at it as both a profession and an activity of managing relations with measures short of war. And at the same time, as I already mentioned, a key tool in implementing foreign policy by engaging and influencing nation states, organizations, and other actors on the world stage. And the set of these skills and the duties and the responsibilities comprises what I think of as a diplomatic tradecraft. Let me finish with this slide. And I know you want to turn this off, but if it's helpful to keep this on just as during the discussion, I'm just a suggestion here, because there's so much in this. I don't want to prolong my monologue, but I'm guessing that at some point during the questions, some of these will. We don't have to. We don't have to. Hopefully, people can take it in and. There is so much packed in this. I'm very flexible, so it's.
The discussion for
Okay.
this part, but we can turn it back on for the Q&A.
Okay. So let me just focus on a couple of these, because when it comes to some of the more obvious skill sets like communication, I'm sure you can figure out how it applies here. Some of these skill sets, of course, apply to many professions, not just diplomacy. But diplomacy is such a unique profession that cannot be replicated anywhere else. What happens in an embassy, you can't just copy and paste, right? Now, that said, I do believe that some of these skills can be very useful in other fields, like international business, for example. But let's look at writing. Writing is the way one writes in diplomacy is very particular. And Ambassador Silliman, who co-drafted the chapter on diplomatic reporting and writing, and of course talk more about that. But it's not academic writing, I can tell you that. And we are in an academic institution, but every Foreign Service officer will tell you that they had almost a culture shock when they first joined, because the way they'd been taught to write, it was very different from what they had to do once in the Foreign Service. Listening. You don't just listen for the sake of listening. You're listening with very specific purposes. First, to build and cultivate relationships, but also to gather information that you then will send back to your government so you can help it when making decisions. Let me focus on a couple of the sort of unique ones, like empathy. Why do I put empathy first? Because for me, the basis of diplomacy is empathy for the views of others, not sympathy, right? You don't have to agree with those views. You just have to understand them. if you are in a foreign country, if you post it, who are the main players in that country? What makes it tick? Hopefully you speak the language. Hopefully you know a lot about the history of the country. How does the government make decisions? Where does it come from when making those decisions? What are the national interests at play for them? Right? Even if you disagree with them, even if it's your adversary that you're talking about or talking with, and if you're convinced you will never ever be on the same page and you always have diverging views, you'll be so much more effective if you do understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Right? You can inform your policymakers back home much better, but not only that. When these policymakers try to come up with policies that affect the country in question, or perhaps responding to something that's happening in that country, these policies will have a much higher chance of success if they're informed by actual facts on the ground, not by imagining how this other government operates. Because the way the United States government makes decisions is not the way that the Japanese or the Chinese government make decisions, or the Russian or any of the others, right? So this is what I mean by empathy. Understanding the views, the positions, the reasoning, the motivation of the other side, whatever it might be. So let me finish here, and I know I'm leaving it sort of in the, without a ribbon tied at the end, but that's on purpose because we're continuing. This is just the beginning, the opening, and I'm sure the discussion will be much more interesting than anything I can say in a monologue. So thanks again, and should I pass it to Ambassador Wayne now, or okay? I'm delighted, as Ambassador Campbell said, that two of the contributors to the book, Ambassador Doug Silliman and Ambassador Lisa Kubicki, are joining us. There are 18 former career diplomats, most of them former ambassadors, that I asked to help me with the different chapters in the book, and many of them also happen to be instructors at the academy. You know what? What did I do? Never mind. I just wanted to show the very, let's see if I can, yeah, I'm a Mac person, so just the very last slide, very, very last 11. Oh, yeah. Yes. Something I missed I failed to say the other day in Dublin, so I have to do it here. If any, because I'll forget at the end, if any of you are interested in the training we provide, we have a course in the summer for current undergraduate and graduate students. And that is every July. This will be our 8th this coming summer. So take a look at the website. And if you're not sure if diplomacy is a profession for you, all it'll take to figure out whether it is reading the book. And I used to say, look, there are many young people who just don't have enough information to make a decision about diplomacy as a career. That even on the State Department website, there aren't enough specific things there to help people make a decision that is so important for the rest of their lives. Because let's face it, unless you've worked at an embassy, you don't know what happens in an embassy. Right? There just isn't enough out there. And so I used to say, if you are on the fence, or if you think that diplomacy might be for you, but you don't know, you're not sure, I used to say, come take a course, and by the end of the course, you will know if it is for you. Now I can say, all you have to do is read the book. By the end of the book, you will know, and it's much cheaper than a course. So anyway, so thanks again. Yes.
We're going to have some fun talking about some of the challenges of thinking through this course and where we go from here. So we have this very nice book, which actually walks through 20 different chapters.
15.
15 different chapters. I was just going to turn to that so I can look. See that we have 15 different chapters plus an afterwards and a foreword. So that makes 17. So let's be accurate here. But we could explore some of the different aspects of carrying out diplomacy, acting in diplomacy, which is a complex set of activities and really does draw on many of the different assets that people in the diplomatic service develop over time. And so let's talk a little bit about that. We have Doug Silliman, who wrote a little bit about the political work that goes on. Lisa Kubitsky, who wrote a bit about the economic work, and of course Nicholas Kralev, who tried to keep it all in line and make sure it made sense and hung together. So so why don't we maybe I'll just start at the far end and work over this way. So when you were thinking about, okay, what do we have to tell the world about what our political work is aimed at doing? What are we trying to do? What did you start off doing?
Okay, so you can see this in the chapter that I co-wrote with Eunice Reddick. Diplomacy is the world's second oldest profession. It is in fact a profession, but I've got receipts. If you go back to any budding Assyriologist here, anybody can read cuneiform script? Probably not. But there's a marvelous work written by a scholar named Amanda Podani called The Brotherhood of Kings, which analyzes the palm-sized clay tablets that went back and forth between the capitals of Assyria, Babylon, Samaria, the Hittites. And it was all about, we've lost one diplomatic skill, which was getting the sons and daughters of kings married off to create alliances. That's kind of fallen away from our core duties. But the rest of it looks very much like what we probably did on a day-to-day basis, arranging trade, trying to figure out how to move goods better, making sure that the people that we wanted to visit the capitals were able to visit the capitals and have discussions about those people over there who are getting too strong, and maybe we need to align our armies and do something about that. So it is a very old profession, and it is a profession that even 5,000 years ago was based on the skills that Nick laid out here. I'm going to say, Nick, I'm going to add a third basket to your two big baskets of foreign service skill sets. And I think that this may be the biggest one, and that's managing your own capital at home. Because when people ask me what was the most difficult country I ever had to deal with, it was without a question the United States. Because you were inside the bureaucracy, you got the pressure from all these different sides, and you had to help manage up as well as you were reporting up. One of the things that I focused on in my career, I was a career political officer, served mostly in the Middle East, and ended my career with 3 tours of duty in Baghdad, where people really wanted to know what was going on the ground. So I wrote the chapter, or co-wrote the chapter on diplomatic writing and reporting. And what Nick says, when you come out of graduate school, you come out of the PhD, there is absolutely no way you can write a proper diplomatic reporting cable, because you have to push your information into 5 or 6 paragraphs so that the really busy people who have 100 cables lined up on their computer screen can actually have the time to read it. And this is one of the most important skills. And for those of you who are interested in diplomatic writing, diplomatic reporting, you really need to be taking journalism classes, not history classes, and not working on your PhD dissertation, because the styles of writing are very different. I think the main reason, Nick, and I don't think I've ever told you this before, that I agreed to help write the chapter on diplomatic reporting is that when I was the head of the political section at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, I had a staff of 25 political officers who worked for me. So anybody who was in the Foreign Service realizes how incredibly large that is, bigger than several embassies. Of those, only 4 had any experience in diplomatic or political reporting before. They were administrative officers, they were consular officers, people who had done all of these other skill sets, but they didn't really know how to take notes at a meeting. They didn't know how to structure a briefing memo for their boss. They didn't understand how to distill an hour-and-a-half conversation into 5 useful paragraphs. And I spent much of my year tour as the head of the political section teaching 21 of the 25 of my staff, starting from zero, how to write, how to think, and to never go anywhere without a notebook and at least one pen or pencil. Because if you don't write it down, it didn't exist when you come back 12 hours later to write a cable. So, Nick, I mean, I will support you, Nick, in saying this work is actually very important. It is something that diplomats who look at the politics of countries, who look at relations between governments on the political side and even on the trade side, have to do every single day. And this is a really good effort to get people to understand the nuts and bolts of executing all of the skill sets that you had laid out.
Thank you. That's very good. It reminds me of Valerie Giscard d'Estaing, who had a little card that he would pull out of his pocket. And he'd go down through all of that. He learned how to put it all down from in one little place. And so this is the same set of skills that people from different professions, different countries have around the world, that they can put this into a very concise version and then share it with others. So thank you. Lisa.
The question is, what do you need to know?
Well, I talked a little bit about the economic side.
Oh, okay. Let me say one thing in general before the
No,
economic
that's
side.
fine.
You really have to be curious about the world. You have to have some empathy for the people you're dealing with. Doesn't mean you like what they believe, but you do have to be interested in forging some kind of connection with the people that you're dealing with. Diplomacy, at the end of the day, is people. It's personal relationships. We do a lot more of it now online, but you can't do all of it online. So curiosity about the world and flexibility, because you do get asked to do many different tasks in the course of a career, even in the course of a single tour. In economics, when you're junior, you start out with a lot of analysis of data. As you get more senior, you're becoming more of a manager and you're becoming more of a person who's saying, what are the big ideas? What do we need to really look at to understand this place or to respond to our government? And then in that context, you're suggesting certain kinds of reporting. But there are many kinds of work that people in the economic specialty or track do. Everything from gathering information that's needed for negotiations. For example, a long time ago when China wanted to be in the World Trade Organization, we have the U.S. Trade Representative's Office that does the actual negotiations, but you have an army of foreign service officers out and commercial officers out there looking for information so that the negotiating team knows the facts and knows what to bring up during a negotiation. So in my case, one of the examples was, what was the structure of the insurance industry in China? Were there opportunities for U.S. companies to participate in it? If there weren't, maybe that was something we wanted to negotiate. So I did that particular one with a commercial officer. She was doing it to advise the individual company or companies that would come to her, the U.S. ones, and I was doing it for the sort of grand policy approach. But in the job I'm in now, because I'm back at state working, it's a kind of a creativity game. There are all these different programs all around the government. A whole bunch of them try to encourage entrepreneurship, for example. But when you're trying to put together an initiative that is going to make the part of the world I work in now, which is Western Hemisphere, more globally competitive, and do it in a way that supports the U.S., doesn't compete with the U.S., what is it you're going to try to do? So it's a matter of understanding what are all the programs that are out there and which ones can we regionalize in the case of my program. So these are just two examples. But economics gets you into almost every field that you can imagine, but from the economic point of view. I used to spend a lot of time anti-corruption and financial transactions, money laundering. My first visit to the very nice little a place called Macau, which is now under Chinese management. The first visit was about money laundering, which was eye-opening. So there are many, many, many different things that you're going to do, and they're all important. They're actually pretty much all fun, except maybe sanctions, not so much.
Well, very good. So now, Nicholas, you got to bring together all these experts, and you had an idea of what you wanted to pull out. What was your vision of what you were hoping to convey to the audiences that you had about diplomacy and what all was involved? You had politics, the economics, a few of the administrative and other parts of it also, but it all had to fit together. So what did you come to see?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, both of you talked about skills that were on the list. That's why I wanted to keep it up, because there were so many things that the human eye is probably not trained to retain all the information. But the one you talked about, intellectual curiosity, that's number 3, I think, on the list, after empathy and language ability. Anyway, okay, so this question to me really is about what business I had as a former journalist, right? Publishing the first practical diplomacy textbook ever in 2024 years of history of humankind. So you of course heard about my experience with covering the State Department and visiting all these embassies and researching and writing a previous book called America's Other Army, which was a reporting book. I consider it sort of a snapshot of the US Foreign Service at the beginning of the century. It was published in 2012. So not quite the beginning, but still sort of the end of the first and the beginning of the second decade. So I'm an outsider. I've never worked for the government, but I think that's an advantage, because I think it gives me the opportunity to identify deficiencies in the system that someone who's been in the system for 3 or 4 decades might just take for granted, and perhaps might say to themselves, oh, this is how it is, and we'll just put up with it. So when it comes to training, my big thing is training, or the lack of it. What Ambassador Silliman said about his officers in Baghdad, he actually told me some of it when I met him in Baghdad in 2012. So he was in that job as the political counselor or head of the political section. And I remember you told me something, you didn't tell me exactly what you just said here, but we were talking about how you edit cables and all that. And of course, I met some of your officers in the section, and yes, some of them were doing political work for the first time, by the way. Remember Sumreen Mirza? And to me, that did not make sense. That rather than do his job, he spent so much time teaching people how to do their job. It just didn't make sense. But that's what they say in the State Department. Well, diplomacy, for decades and decades, diplomacy cannot be taught. The only way to learn it is on the job. Well, okay, I get it. It's a very particularly unique profession. There are some aspects of it you have to learn on the job. Absolutely, I agree to that. I agree that you can hone your skills on the job. There is no replacement. You just have to do it in practice. But I thought, even as a journalist, after America's Other Army came out, I thought there must be a way, there should be a way to give people at least the foundation of the skill sets, right, of tradecraft, on which they can build as they go and up the hierarchy and from post to post to that. And so that's why I started the academy. I looked around and tried to figure out, has anyone ever taught diplomacy outside of government? Right? I didn't have any plans to be within government. So as an organization that was independent, has there ever been an organization or an institution that provided practical diplomacy training? And I spent a year researching this before I started the academy, and I didn't find in this country or in any other country. And so we started in 7 years ago. And a couple of years in, it was clear that, so this is actually funny. I used to say that we teach when we started. There's one of the catchphrases was we teach what's not in the books. In other words, I didn't want to teach what universities teach, which is international relations, right? And that's an academic discipline. I wanted to teach what nobody else teaches. Otherwise, what was the purpose of creating this new thing? And that's why I asked all three former ambassadors to teach sessions on economic tradecraft, so economic tradecraft, although Ambassador Wayne is actually a political officer, but he fell into economic tradecraft. And then Ambassador Silliman as a political officer, but more important, reporting and writing. And I wanted practitioners to teach, right? I wanted them to pass on the skills they learned over 30, 40 years, because you were in for 40 years, right? And then you were for 38, and you were 35 in 2 days, right? So imagine what accumulation of experience and skills this is, right? And they retire, and this goes, right? It's really, to me, it was a waste. So I decided we will focus on practice, right? We will spend at least half of the time in all courses on simulations, other practical exercises, and they will be based for the most part on case studies from the ambassador's own experience, right? Both because I think that this is how one best learns practical skills. And a couple of years in, it became clear that we could save a lot of time by having a book, a textbook, even though I used to say that we teach what's not in the books. And so when COVID hit, I decided to, initially it was going to be just for us, a textbook for us, just for the academy. And then, we all had more time to think during COVID, right? And especially those of us who didn't get it back then. I got it this past July, finally, for the first time. Not that I was trying to catch it. Anyway, so I thought we would save time that we could spend in exercises if there was a text, if there were a book that our trainees could read before we start, and then they read every chapter as we go from session to session every day. And I approached Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard. Harvard never got back to me, but Oxford and Cambridge both wanted it, and we ended up with Cambridge. And so Cambridge University Press is the publisher of the book. And just to finish the very long answer to your question, what I envisioned and, with the idea, I wrote with the help of 18 mostly former, a couple of current Foreign Service officers, most of them ambassadors, and many of them had been ambassador 2, 3 times. Tom Pickering was ambassador 7 times. He's unique, right? Everybody knows Tom Pickering. So I wanted to come up with a body of knowledge between those covers of the book that everyone who starts working as a diplomat should know on day one. Right? I think this is the body of knowledge that, you can save so much time, right? The chapter on reporting and writing, yes, it's in a book form, right? There's a limit to how well you can teach skills in a book. But I think if every Foreign Service officer on day one has the knowledge that's contained in the book, including how to write a cable or a memo, that would save time. I think ambassadors and DCMs around the world will be so thankful to all of us that we've done that. And for the life of me, I still don't understand why FSI is still not using this book. It's not even mentioned as an option on the State Department website. Honestly, this is mind-boggling to me. There are dozens of books mentioned on the State Department career website. This book is not even mentioned on it. This is shameful to me, and I'm hurt personally, but forget that. I'm not thinking about me. Our work is done when it comes up to the book, to the book. But in terms of the new officers coming in, right, the classes we have and the orientation on the first day of orientation, they could come to orientation already with the knowledge in the book, and that's why I wanted to do this in the first place.
Well, fortunately, the book is out there, so the knowledge is available and can be made available both to those going to FSI, but also studying diplomacy from other aspects. So let me ask Doug and Lisa, what you see as the value added of this new book of trying to go through and take case studies in particular aspects and share it with people who want to be diplomats or want to be better diplomats.
It gives you a sense of the, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. It gives you a sense of the range of things that are out there. I'm a person that actually learns through case studies or through working through something or by talking to somebody who has actually worked an issue. And so in that sense, the book is pretty useful.
And frankly, I'm a bit of a book geek, and most of my undergraduate and graduate roommates thought I spent too much time reading and studying and researching. So whenever I go into a new tour, I would buy 8 books about the country or about the issues I was going to work on. If I had had one before my first tour that said, this is kind of your handbook to being a diplomat, I'd have probably referred to it, and I would have learned different things from different parts of the book over the course of my career. And as you get more and more senior, when you're the ambassador, you're in charge of pretty much everything that the United States does in that country, which encompasses everything in the book and the entire set of skills that Nick laid out. To learn that gradually over a 15, 20, 30-year career, but to start out with that base, I think is really useful. So I'm glad that you did it, Nick. And I think that it is something that people can get a sense of what the Foreign Service actually is and what parts of the Foreign Service might actually interest them. Is it negotiating with warlords? Is it negotiating one of the demarches that I talked about written in Washington that went out was the annual EU sauce demarche, what the technical specifications for ketchup and sugar content, all sorts of things, to try to make sure whether they could get sort of exemptions under EU tariffs and regulations. This was when I was in Turkey and encountered this. This is the kind of thing that you might not find out about until you're actually there and somebody expects you to know it, but you've never heard of that kind of diplomacy before. This book would give you that little extra starting, a little cheating getting out of the starting gate.
Yeah, I think.
Can I say
ahead,
one thing?
Please do. Please do.
You have to understand there's almost every kind of job in the Foreign Service. I was in a different course about a week ago, and one of my colleagues was one of the people that worked in the office trying to get our hostages out of countries. He happened to be the family liaison person, so he's talking to the families of the people who had been taken hostage. And he had a psychology background, makes sense. So you don't think that these jobs are in there, but there's another job, which is being the liaison for the Olympics. That's pretty fun. There are a lot of really fun jobs out there.
Can I just, I want to clarify, because I assume that many of you are trying to figure out what this means if all these jobs in this variety, and then are there specializations and all that. So just to kind of get that out of the way, there are 5 career tracks in the Foreign Service: political, economic, public diplomacy, consular, and management or administration, right? Political, this is different from the political appointees we have. So that, right, the political appointees are not in the career Foreign Service, right? So those 5 career tracks, you can work, let's say, in the economic as Ambassador Kubisky, but within that economic career track, there is so much variety. You can work in one country, you can work on sanctions. On another, you can work on anti-corruption. Or in the third country, you may work on rare minerals. In a fourth, you may work on environmental and science or health issues. So that's what she means by there are all kinds of things. We don't want to, some people say that the Foreign Service or diplomacy is a good choice for people who don't have long attention spans because you have to change every 3 years or less, right? You have to, right? You can't stay in the same country for more than 3 years. In many countries, it's 2 years. So in a few like Iraq, it's only 1 year. So this means that you move around and you have to bid on new jobs every time, right? And it can be overseas, can be here at the State Department. And within the the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, which Ambassador Wayne headed right after or during and after 9/11, there are all kinds of. I mean, you can negotiate open skies agreements, which of course allow for the United States and other countries to have start new flights or to actually, open skies. So open skies is about lifting the limits to how many flights can fly between the two countries per week. So on that, and the last thing I wanted to say on the something that you two mentioned and in your questions to them, and it's about academia. Even though we said that academic writing is very different, I think this is just one aspect. I think academia has a role to play in preparing the next generation of diplomats. Actually, that's why I'm here. One of the reasons I'm here. It already does a lot, of course, but I think that it would be very useful if practical diplomacy skills were taught in academia. Right? Well, a university can start with one course, and in fact, the book is written in such a way that the number of chapters happen to also be how many weeks there are in a semester. So if a professor wanted to use the book to teach a course based on it, there are 15 chapters. I know that sometimes, depending on years, a semester can have 13 or 14 or 15 weeks, but not more than 15. And I'm saying this because some of you may know when you submit a book proposal to an academic publisher, they send it out for what's called peer reviews. They want to see whether there'll be interest in the book once it's published before they decide whether to publish it. And some of the professors who were asked by Cambridge to review the proposal said, we have many students who are interested in careers in diplomacy, and they come to us for advice as professors. But none of us has ever worked at an embassy. We don't even know what an embassy does on a daily basis. How are we supposed to advise these kids who are trying to figure out whether diplomacy might be for them? And since we finished the book, I've been asking deans and vice deans in schools around the country about the prospect of teaching practical diplomacy skills. And there are a couple of programs, actually degree programs, a degree, let's say a bachelor's degree. There's a school up in New Jersey called Seton Hall University. They have a bachelor in diplomacy and something else. And I looked at the curriculum. I said, well, this is not diplomacy, it's international relations or affairs, whatever you call it, international studies, but it's not, right? There is one practitioner teaching in the whole school, one practitioner. And I asked one of the vice deans, am I not looking at the right curriculum? Or the syllabi? Because I'm looking on the website. And I said, why? What about this skill and the other skill and the other skill? And she said, well, we believe we are teaching diplomacy. Well, so apparently we have very different ideas about what diplomacy is.
Right. Well, we do, and many will give a different definition of that. And there are many courses around Washington, D.C. that actually do look at different aspects of diplomacy. Maybe not everything, but they do go through each of the different skills that are needed in order to do that. And there is a difference between what you get in places where there has been a lot of practitioners, which is largely in this area. And then you get one or two practitioners out in other places. So that's, that's one of the challenges you had. Now, the part of the approach in looking at this has been you need basic education You get a lot of that basic education. And then if you go to graduate school, a year or two, you sometimes focus in more of these things. And that's the kind of program, of course, you are aimed at delivering to students also at your academy and doing. And that's, I think, where different programs are trying to go in their different ways. And that's sort of what professional programs within the Foreign Service also aim at trying to doing. And you're doing a wonderful job of sharing this with them. And that's why it's so great to have people like as we have here with Lisa and Doug to be here and look at this. So let me just ask from the two of you to say first, and then you come up at the end, what's the value added of this kind of education that you're getting both in this book, but then that are added in the course that's offered over the summer that you do have?
As I said before, I was a book geek. I studied, I wrote research papers, I spent way too much time in the library, and all that was great. And I built up this huge bit of knowledge. And I was studying at that point, you can tell my age now, the Soviet Union. So I was a Russian speaker. I was spending hours and hours working on my master's thesis in Russian documents. So when I got to the State Department, they sent me as a consular officer to Port-au-Prince, Haiti. I didn't speak French. I didn't speak Haitian Creole. I knew nothing about visa law. So I had to scramble and completely change the way that I thought and the way that I worked, which was just fine. But if I had had a little bit more idea before I joined the Foreign Service, that it wouldn't necessarily be an academic paper of the effect of U.S. visa law on poverty in Haiti or something like that, that I was going to be actually adjudicating whether people could come to the United States legally or not legally, it would have really been helpful. So the chapter on consular affairs, I would have liked to have read because even consular training was the nuts and bolts of how you did it, what the laws were, not the day in, day out process of adjudicating visas and administering visa law. So I think that you do need to have a good basic education. Everybody has to have a broad ranging knowledge. I think Henry Kissinger gave us that before most of us were even in the Foreign Service. When he came back to the State Department, when he became Secretary of State, the legend is he went in and there were people wearing bush suits from Africa and guayaberas from Latin America. And they said, these people aren't American anymore. I want everybody to, dress in a suit and tie, and we can put any person at this rank in any job anywhere in the world, and they will do particularly well. And that may be the ethos that started back in the 1970s that led to the idea that you have to adapt yourself and you have to be trained through mentoring as you get pulled up from Ulaanbaatar and dropped in Basra, or vice versa, I think, in your case.
I do remember that. Sure. Lisa.
I'm going to pick up from where Doug left off, but with a different angle. I was always interested. I came into the Foreign Service and they said, okay, you're going to be in the economic track. Okay, fine. But I had always had a personal interest in immigration. Who were the immigrants? My great-grandparents were immigrants, and, I was taught the myth, all immigrants are good, there's a large amount of truth to that, but it's not everyone. But I just had that intellectual curiosity. So when I was thrown into the consular work, visa work and immigrant visa work in Mexico City, which gets a huge number of applicants, I had a chance to find out what the process is. What is U.S. law? It's very complicated, actually. But what is U.S. law? And then pretty much on my own time, do a huge survey of about 1,200 immigrant visa applicants that we were seeing in Mexico City at that time, to ask them. I designed a survey and to say, who are you? Where'd you come from? Why did you move illegally, mostly, to the U.S.? And, and then their economic situation and how they were doing in the U.S. And so I had a chance to take my personal interest and develop it in the Foreign Service. But if we go back to the book, or we go back to a course, it's very helpful to learn, and you can study a lot of this in a book. what are the relationships between, start with the US government, all the different US government agencies, and then add all the US different types of stakeholders, private sector, civil society actors, and so on. And then how does that interact with international organizations? How does that interact with the organizations and groups in other countries? It helps if somebody teaches you some of that structure. I never worked on Europe, but it's useful to know what the EU is, or what the European Commission is, or any of the myriad European organizations. You can learn that stuff. You can learn who does what. And so that's a good, it's helpful. It's an additional benefit if you know that before you get in. Having said that, I will tell you that because US diplomats are in different tours every 2 to 4 years, or 1 to 4 years, you're pretty much asked to become an expert in 6 months. So, day one, you didn't really know too much about the place, but by, 6 months, you're briefing. And so you have to want to learn fast. It's exciting, it's stimulating, but you do have to do it.
Very good. So before we open it up widely here, Nicholas, I want you to share a little bit about why you thought it would be useful to have an outside academy that would help share these thoughts.
Yes, let me first clarify that you can choose your own career track these days, okay? So just because Ambassador Kubicki was told she was going to be in the economic one, that you have the freedom today to choose. So when you actually submit your application to the Foreign Service, you have to choose one of the 5 that I mentioned before. Okay, so when I was leaving journalism, I had 3 criteria for what I wanted to do next. 2 out of 3 would have been great, but 3 out of 3 is, of course, much better. So the first one was, I wanted to do something nobody's ever done before. I wanted to do something that I loved to do, that I was looking forward every day to doing. So these were the main. The third was, if I could help people in the process, would have been so much better, right? So this is how I look at the Academy and the book by extension. It's something nobody had done before. I absolutely enjoy what I'm doing. And I think that the Academy has helped people already. We have 300 graduates from 52 countries, right? Some of them have joined their country's foreign service since they trained at the Academy. So that's what it is.
Sounds very good. All right, why don't we take some questions? Please, if you can come up to the, thank you.
Microphone on? Yes. Okay. Hey, thank you so much for all of the wisdom that you've shared with us today. I think my question might be more appropriately directed to Ambassador Silliman, but anyone else on the stage could feel free to weigh in as well. I am a master's student in the School of International Service. I have a particular interest in Middle East affairs, and I'm contemplating a career in diplomacy. So I have like 2 related questions. How would maybe a master's student publish in the field? What would be your advice? Since many of my courses require me to write papers, and so I'm looking to be able to publish and advance my writing skills and kind of my legitimacy in the field moving forward. And also, my second question would be, what would you recommend that I do in the meantime between now and graduation professionally to be able to enhance my resume? Thank you.
2 good and not easy to answer questions. The first one is, if you are interested in writing short or long academic papers to get published that would be peer reviewed, you should come to people like me and the institute that I run called the Arab Gulf States Institute or the Middle East Institute or the Asia Foundation or whatever else is out there in Washington and figure out who the editor is and contribute something. We are always looking for authors who are interested in writing on the topics. Gulf States Institute, we tend to do the GCC, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, that really fun part of the world. But there is really no end of audience for well-researched papers coming from graduate students. And one of the things that we do at our institute is we've got an actual mandate to help develop scholarship, both Arab scholarship, European scholarship, and American scholarship on the part of the world that we cover. So but that's not only us, that's most of what think tankdom does in Washington. So I would recommend if there are things that you like reading, organizations that do work that you appreciate, go to them first and say, I'd like to submit something to a graduate student at American University, at SIS, and I'm sure they will say, send us something and we'll talk. And that's because that's what we do. You would have to get past my truly scary executive editor and the very strict, I mean, she changes my stuff all the time. And I've gotten used to it now after several years. But I mean, there is it's a pretty rigorous process. But that said, there are a lot of people who can be interested in what you have to say, what your research has been.
That's a great process to go through because it gets you to hone your own thinking.
And our standard, I mean, our standard writing product is much closer to what the Foreign Service wants. We do 1,000 to 1,500 word short takes that are really good for undergraduates, business executives, policymakers who don't have time to read a 40-page paper and look at all the resources behind it. We try to do that for them, and that's why our editor is so scary, because she actually reads all the stuff that you use as references to make sure that what you say is actually in that reference.
And that's very good advice because a lot of the think tanks around Washington do produce those short pieces aimed at actual policymakers and those thinking about it. Please.
Any questions about Harry?
Oh, refrain from that. Read, and read more. And don't only read in what you're interested in, read worldwide, read topic-wide, read about AI, read about whether PEPFAR is going to continue in Africa, read everything and anything that you have any interest in, keep up the intellectual curiosity, and I mean, challenge yourself with a second language, a third language. These kinds of things are very useful when you get into the Foreign Service. And having studied, I think, 5 languages at FSI, it's better if you come in with them than having to learn them mid-career.
That I would say is true. In fact, it's much easier just to have to learn 2 of them rather than 5. But there's a lot you can learn and a lot you can practice on. Please.
Hello, my name is Harmony Keys. I am an undergrad here at American University and I take the International Relations course. And I do want to be a diplomat very badly, but I'm not very sure exactly, if I actually want to do that because it is a huge commitment. But my question today is, because of the lack of diplomats around the world, do you think that this causes more wars to erupt between countries like we are seeing now?
Okay, thank you very much. Who would like to?
I think there is a direct line between the state of the world, in other words, the mess the world is in, and the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of diplomacy. So I do believe that if, in particular, political leaders, heads of state and government, if they invested more in diplomacy and not just hiring diplomats, right? That's probably the easier part. It's also equipping them with the right tools they need, right? This is everything from the compensations the compensation they provide, the salaries they provide, to the actual training that we've been talking about. In our Foreign Service, we have, at least for now, we've solved the problem with the starting salaries. But 20 years ago, it was half of what they were paying, right? The State Department now pays a pretty good entry-level salary based on, I mean, depending on your degree and any experience you might have had, languages you speak, military service, you can make from between sort of mid-60s to low 70s in the thousands a year. And that's a pretty good starting salary, right? It used to be less than half of that 20 years ago. And so I think we've solved that issue for the time being. But
What was your starting salary, Tony? Mine was 18,000.
yes, that was I'll give you more current examples. I was just in Dublin the other day. The Ministry of Foreign, so the Department of Foreign Affairs of Ireland, on its website says that a new Foreign Service officer there makes 38,000 euro a year. That's poverty line. How are you going to live in that in Dublin? Because other than the United States, pretty much every other country requires new diplomats to spend 2 or 3 years in the ministry at headquarters at the beginning. We send people out right away just because we need to fill positions. We have a graduate of our academy who is Czech, and he joined the Foreign Service there last year. He can barely make ends meet. This is how bad the situation is. So this is about hiring and equipping diplomats, but more fundamentally, I think that political leaders don't quite connect the dots between their goals in policy making and using diplomacy to accomplish those goals. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, so to me, it makes sense about the benefit of connecting the dots. And what I mean by this is, at the beginning, I mentioned that decision making is different from government to government to government, right? The way that the US government makes decisions is very different from Japan or China, whatever country. Unfortunately, there is something called mirror imaging, and many politicians engage in that process. Mirror imaging means that you assume that other countries make decisions the way you do, right? But if you listen to your diplomats who are serving there on the ground in those countries, you will be better informed about what's happening in those countries. You will understand better why what's happening is happening, right? And then when you make your decisions and your policies, as I said before, they will have a higher chance for success if you take into account the facts on the ground and the way that these other governments make decisions and are likely to respond to them. So this is a cycle that I think is just, connecting the dots, I think, is probably the best way I can describe it.
Let me say this in a shorter form. You know the phrase "give peace a chance" was in a song, right? Give peace a chance. When you're a diplomat, you're looking to understand the other, whoever you're talking to. You're looking to find the similarities or the common ground. You're trying to get to yes. I mean, you have a U.S. policy to uphold. You're trying to show that your U.S. policy is also good for that person. And you're also trying to inform your government that that's not going to work because they have this fundamental belief. So you can think of it as a negotiation, but it's not quite a negotiation. But it is definitely, as Nick just said, a deep understanding of where the other guy is coming from and how can we work together. There's a preventive aspect to it. If you think of all these international organizations, they're trying to make rules about in new fields, like right now in digital and cyber, what are the trade rules that there should be, for example, before it becomes too much of a problem, right? Before it becomes a problem. So there's a preventive aspect to this work that's also very important. So yes, give peace a chance. Try to get us all more or less on the same page.
Very good. Thank you. Please.
Hello, thank you all so much for your time. My name is Jenna Prunty, and I'm a graduate student here at SAS. I'm also a Pickering Fellow, so I plan on joining the Foreign Service when I graduate in 2026, with hopefully a focus on the Middle East and the political sector. Which leads my question to you, Ambassador Sullivan. I would like to ask, you'd mentioned that the US was a hard place to be posted due to upward pressures and competitive spirit. How do you mitigate some of that pressure when you're working with other US representatives?
Well, the biggest problem with living in Washington that I had with my family was just paying for living in Washington. We often took out a home equity loan so we could have the cash to have 2 kids in Washington and actually live the life that we wanted to, and then paid it back when we were overseas and getting free housing. So for us, this was, I mean, this is a whole nother, it's not taught in Nick's book, but there are tricks on how to come back here at a base salary and then go overseas to some place where we usually lived, which was not very nice, for a bigger salary. Part of this in the United States is a little bit easier. The Department of State is the first cabinet department. There is a certain rank to the Department of State and a weight to it that not all other countries have. And when you are overseas, and if you are lucky to be the ambassador, the deputy chief of mission, you are basically, as a in charge of, which means you have to negotiate what you want, but from a position of strength with every other part of the US government, with one exception, which we can go into if you really care about it, but the CIA, the NSA, USAID, the Battle Monuments Commission, which I worked with in Tunisia, because there's a wonderful World War II cemetery in Tunisia. So you are actually in charge of making sure that everybody is marching to the same drummer, more or less, and you will receive from the president a nice little letter that says, this man or this woman is my personal representative in country X, and you are supposed to listen to him or her. What you have to do, though, is develop the skills in Washington and the skills overseas to make sure that everything lines up the way you wanted it to do. My trick was always having very close relationships with all of my other agency friends. And for example, when I was in Baghdad, I was a political counselor, the deputy, and the ambassador in Baghdad. By the time I got to be ambassador, I knew a lot of people in all of these other agencies. And I would make sure that we decided what we wanted to do on the ground in Iraq before anybody sent anything up the chain of command. So that when there was an interagency meeting, all of our briefing papers that came from the embassy back to headquarters all had the same talking points, and it made things much easier. But you have to compromise, you have to talk through with your colleagues, but you are in a position of strength, at least in our system. But it doesn't mean that you get to do exactly what you want and force other people to do things. So it is appreciation of the balance of power among, 162 times. But Nick, the other numbers I like, there are more people in the Forest Service than in the Foreign Service. And there are more lieutenant colonels in the Army than there are in the Foreign Service. So the budget, the numbers, the ability to simply crunch information and supply it, we can't match anybody, but it is that step up and the negotiating and intellectual curiosity and empathy. All of those things work with your colleagues as well as they work with foreigners. And it's a way to live your life and have a more happy, peaceful life as well.
Exactly.
I hope that answered the question.
That's a good answer. Thank you
you.
very much. Please.
Hi, I'm Adan. I'm a undergraduate student here at the School of International Service. And I remember the name of this talk, if I'm not mistaken, being The Future of Diplomacy. And I listened to a quote a couple days ago. I cannot for the life of me remember who said it, but it was like, for the last 10 years, diplomacy has been kind of resting, coming off of after the 90s, a tense time in the 2010s, the 2010s, 2000 were kind of a chillier period, and now the world's back in this mess. So although obviously no one can predict what's coming, but you're obviously more informed than probably the rest of us, what's the future of diplomacy? What's coming for diplomacy, for the discipline?
Okay, who wants to take it?
Let me clarify the title. So it was the future of diplomacy, and then preparing the next generation, right? Future of diplomacy is the next generation of diplomats, right? The human resources are the best resource in diplomacy, right? The title didn't mean to predict what diplomacy will look like in 10 or 20 years, but just to say that investing in the next generation is very much worth it. Anyway, I will let the ambassadors talk more specifically if they wish to about what I think you're asking, which is more policy than diplomacy, right? Look, you may have the best skilled diplomats in the world. If the policy you're trying to implement sucks, you cannot make it better. Okay? So, in other words, let's understand who makes policy and who carries out the policy. Diplomats, by and large, do not make policy. A few of them, like Bill Burns, when they become Deputy Secretary of State, in your case, you'd be at the Economic and Business Affairs Bureau, right? Assistant Secretary and higher. These people do get involved in the policy process, but most diplomats do not make policy, right? That is the responsibility of the political appointees because they are named by the president directly. Now, I'm saying this because sometimes I'll be in some country and I'll be asked about, let's say, US policy in the Middle East or whatever, right? And so I have to say, look, there are American diplomats, I'm sure that there are currently American diplomats sitting in Israel who probably disagree with some aspects of US policy in Israel, right? Well, that's part of the job, meaning that this is actually one of the more difficult things in diplomacy. Even if you disagree with a certain policy, even if you think that it's absolutely the wrong thing to do, you have to implement it and you have to promote it and defend it publicly, sometimes on TV in the language of the country you're in, right? When the Iraq war began in 2003, I know personally many US diplomats who thought it was a mistake. And I know some of them had to go on TV in that country and in the local language explain how this was a necessary thing to do and it was the right thing to do, right? So if you can't do this is one of the things people need to know before they get in. Because most of us, I don't think, are born with this skill, right? That it would be very difficult for me, for example, to do that, but I'm not in the Foreign Service. The policy and the skill you can carry out, right? You can do it for years and years and years. And if you're fed up with it, then you can resign. You can also, because it's at least the State Department is a fairly large bureaucracy, even though it's one of the smallest departments in the US government, right? You can, as I said before, because you move around, right? You can wait until your next assignment and hope that you will get a position in another bureau, whatever part of the State Department. But if you're really, really having trouble with certain policies, then of course you can resign.
Lisa, you want to say something? Then we'll go on to the last question.
Certainly in terms of topics, the world is changing after COVID, after AIDS and after COVID. And in between there was Zika and some others. The State Department, for example, started to realize that they actually needed to have a whole bureau devoted to health. With the whole digital and cyber transformation, really, that's been happening. They realized they needed to have a whole bureau devoted to those things. They actually have a special envoy and a bureau, for AI, for example. So there are topics that are brand new that are definitely the future. Not that the traditional ones go away, they don't, but this is more topics. The other thing is, I'm losing my train of thought here, but so the way we do business is changing quite a bit. Private sector. There is not enough official development assistance, that's foreign assistance, foreign aid. Not enough of it in the world to solve all the development problems of the world. And when you don't solve the development problems of the world, you increase the possibility of having disputes and wars, right? So how do you make that up? One way is with the private sector. You have to, the private sector creates jobs, right? So this increasing recognition that there's a big role for the private sector is another change. The idea that if you want to have stable democracies, you actually need to hear your citizens talk, that's not actually a super popular view in many countries in the world, but that is something the US government pushes, and you see it more and more. That's another piece of the future of democracy and of the work of the State Department.
Thank you very much. Final question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ramses Villagrán. I'm a student in SAS, and I have sort of a three-parter for the ambassadors, if that's okay. All right.
What we answer is a different thing, but you can ask whatever you want.
First, why did you join to begin with? What was your original goal? Then, what career path led you to becoming ambassadors from the Foreign Service? And did you ever feel that whatever your original goal was somehow suppressed or changed by your career?
Great.
We have less than 5 minutes.
I'll take on the first one. Yeah, 3 minutes. I joined the Foreign Service because I liked Russian music and Russian literature as a child. My mother played the piano very well. And when I went to high school, my high school teacher said, wow, you're really good at talking to all these different kinds of kids. You should join the State Department. And being in Texas, I said, State Department of what? Public Transportation, State Department of Public Works. What are you talking? She said, no, the Department of State. You'd be a good diplomat. So a woman named Carolyn Hines, who was actually my Latin teacher in high school, pointed me in this direction, and I really haven't looked back since I was 17.
That's a great answer.
I had traveled a lot with my mother to lots of countries. I'd seen lots of countries. I am the absolute generalist. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had marketable skills for knowing something about the rest of the world. I'd been an overseas student and so on. When I went to graduate school, I still didn't know what I wanted to do, but I had this international thing, so I went to Georgetown's MSFS program. Getting out of Georgetown, still didn't know what I wanted to do, but the Foreign Service exam was there, so I took it, I passed it, and so on. So then the career to ambassador, it's difficult to become an ambassador, honestly. But you're trying to make sure that the work you're doing is important to the U.S. government, to the U.S. people, American people. You're responding to the needs, the questions that policymakers are trying to solve and congressmen are trying to solve. So if you do that, and if you enjoy your work, because if you don't enjoy your work, you won't do it well, that helps you move up, and you have hopefully a mentor or two that will help you along, and that's how you can get there with a certain amount of politicking.
Okay. Say anything about what, as you came into this, what you think?
Well, since we are wrapping up, if you ask 100 Foreign Service officers how they came in, what their path was, they all will give you very different answers. So that, I think that's one of the advantages of the Foreign Service, that it has people with such different backgrounds, which is a strength, right? We care a lot about diversity, not just racial, ethnical, gender-based, but also professional diversity. Meaning that in the Foreign Service, Doug, you said that diplomacy is the second oldest profession. Perhaps with the exception of the oldest profession, there are, as far as I know, and there are representatives of all professions in the Foreign Service. We have art gallery directors and former journalists, business people, financiers, military. I met in Mexico City years ago. There was in the consular section, someone who had been a parole officer on Staten Island, so in the prison system, right? So all kinds of people. And that is a huge strength for the Foreign Service, because the State Department really wants the Foreign Service, as they say, to look more like America. And that's great. I think that's an advantage. However, this means that people come with all kinds of experiences into the Foreign Service, and many of them do not have degrees in anything related to international relations, political science, and that's fine, right? People come in with biology degrees, with chemistry degrees, and whatever, journalism, history, and literature, and all that. And that's all great, but you have to give them solid training. So I want to circle back to training, because the strength of diversity is one thing, but when you have people who don't know how to write basic memos, right, or how to perhaps excel at public speaking in a diplomacy context, which is a bit different from your typical everyday context, or if you don't know, if people don't know how to build and cultivate relationships with people from other countries, especially with the governments of those countries, to me, that is a problem. And so that's why I hope that the Foreign Service Institute will build on what they have been doing, right, in the last 15 to 20 years, since Colin Powell, really, and create a very, very solid entry-level course, which I think is currently missing. So,
Thank you.
yeah,
Lisa.
thanks.
I think there have been different surveys done in the State Department. I think quite a few people, at least once they're in it, think that a big part of the reason why they stay is they like the public service. They like the idea of making the world a better place. Sounds corny, but it is genuinely motivating for many people. So you can do it. You will earn a decent middle class salary. You're not ever going to be rich in this profession, but you get a certain amount of job stability with it, and you get to do this pretty neat work of representing the U.S. and trying to make the world better.
Thank you. Thank you all for being with us for this time. And thanks, everybody, for being here. And we'll hope you'll join us again.